Okay, so what we're going to talk about in a little bit here is the trade investigations that have been taking place in 2018, and most of them are hung over from 2017. So what are the topics that we're going to cover today? There's essentially four, right? There's four different types of trade laws thus far that the Trump administration has been actively employing. One of them is quite conventional. The other three are very unconventional. And we're going to walk through all three of them, or all four of them. Okay, so let me start with anti-dumping countervailing duties. And what we'll do also is we'll pin specific products, investigations, things you will have heard about, or Trade Talks episodes, if you happen to listen to the podcast, to each of these just to help put them in a little bit more context. All right, so the first is anti-dumping countervailing duties. How many of you have ever worked in anti-dumping or countervailing? All right, that's what I'm talking. So anybody online, you can't see these people, but basically everybody in the crowd, their hands went up. Everybody is familiar with anti-dumping and CVD. And so obviously this is the most popular is the wrong word. This is the most frequently used of trade laws, right? We've historically seen thousands of these kinds of cases get brought forward, even just within the United States, but around the world. This is the most frequent way nowadays that countries make changes to their trade policy when they want to implement new tariffs or things of that nature. Okay, so what are the ones that we have had come up over the first year of the Trump administration that have made really big news? How has this played into other things? I think there's basically, what have we done? 3 or so related episodes on this topic. So the big one that came up first, I think, was the Bombardier. The Canadian jets. So these new C-series jets that Bombardier, this Canadian aircraft company, has developed. Boeing filed a case saying, hey, these new jets they haven't even been sold in the US yet, but this new contract for $5 billion with Delta, these jets are subsidized, they're being dumped into the US market. So they filed a case. There was this big investigation. We were waiting for 300%. So how many of you work at the Commerce Department? Anybody? Yay, 300% tariffs. So that's what we thought was coming down the pike. And then our friends at the International Trade Commission, how many people are from the International Trade Commission? Yay, our friends at the International Trade Commission said, no injury, right? And so in this particular instance, we're not actually going to impose tariffs, okay? But that was the really, really big one, at least in terms of the politics of it. Actually, the economics, $5 billion for one of those kinds of cases is a pretty big deal. So we had the Bombardier regional jets. We still have ongoing the one in the middle there. So those are logs, right? Do we have any Canadians here? Some Canadians, right? So that's softwood lumber, right? So all Canadians know all about softwood lumber. And so this is a long, ongoing dispute. The United States and Canada have had sort of managing trade in these big giant logs for, decades. This isn't necessarily new. It's just sort of come to a head again recently under the Trump administration, and we're trying to figure out how to navigate that one. That has also then been tied up in the NAFTA negotiations. So does everybody remember and have memorized all the different chapters? So which is the good one for anti-dumping CVD? 19, right? 19. Okay, good. So 19, will Chapter 19 live on in the NAFTA negotiations or not, right? Ambassador Lighthizer this is one of the ones that he wants to strip out, enforceable dispute settlement altogether, but especially the special dispute settlement provisions on anti-dumping countervailing duties. The Canadians desperately want to keep these things in. Why? Well, because $5 billion of softwood lumber exports are at risk. The Bombardier jets were at risk. There's other cases on newsprint, right? So we can understand why they're upset and trying to keep this. And then the last episode that we did specifically really dedicated to anti-dumping and CVDs was our China non-market economy episode. So we have this major dispute going on in Geneva at the WTO. The first one has China challenging the EU, but it's basically they have the same case ongoing against the United States, which is, are we going to be continued to allow to use non-market economy treatment? So the special way of calculating anti-dumping duties, potentially countervailing duties, also when you're doing those kinds of investigations against China. Okay, so crazy interesting stuff happening just even under the conventional trade laws in that really any American presidential administration would be having to deal with when they come into office. Some nuances of things happening that are a little bit different under this administration, but that's kind of standard stuff. All right, so let's turn to the non-standard stuff. Imagine solar panels. So look up at the sky, see the sun, and washing machines, right? Okay, so the second, and that's actually a conventional law. It just really hasn't been used in 15, 20 years or so. But this is the Section 201 law, right? And this one, there's no allegation that anybody's done anything unfair. So nobody's dumped their product into our market. Nobody's getting any subsidies that are illegal. It's just there's a lot of imports coming in. There's way too many of them. And the domestic industry that makes solar panels, that makes washing machines, they're being hurt by these things, and so they ask for protection, right? This is relatively rare in the sense that because arguably of access to import protection through the anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, industries really haven't used safeguards all that frequently. This Section 201 law, they haven't turned to it. They haven't needed to turn to it. The last time we really saw one of these cases was back in 2001, 2002, when the steel industry, right, didn't ask for it. It was a self-initiated case that the George W. Bush administration did back then. But they granted the steel industry massive amounts of import protection under this law. Well, President Trump was confronted with two decisions back in January. Would he impose tariffs, quotas on solar panels and washing machines? Or would he just reject it and say, no, don't need to? Well, he did. He ultimately imposed new import restrictions on both. And so we'll see. I think arguably one of the constraints on companies, industries, unions bringing cases forward under this law in the past is many presidents have been very hesitant about actually implementing import restrictions under this law, even when the ITC found evidence of injury. So it's relatively rare, even when granted the authority, even when the president's granted the authority under this law to implement protection, that he's actually done so. Well, President Trump right out of the gate has done it twice now. And so we might expect to see, more of these cases coming down the pike. Okay, so that's the second law, slightly less conventional than anti-dumping countervailing duty laws. But now we can get really into the unconventional. Okay, so this is the national security law, right? So this is the Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. The last one of these investigations we saw was back in 2001. The last time we saw import restrictions imposed under this law was in the 1980s. There's been fewer than 30 of these investigations in the entire history of this law. It's just a law that hasn't really ever been used to any great extent to stop imports from coming in. So what's happened here? Well, back in April of last year, right? So this is right in the lead up to the 100th day for the Trump administration, right? Remember, right before the 100th day, you gotta have seen to have done something, right? If you're a new administration coming in, not much had happened yet, so they made big announcements. We're going to investigate whether steel and aluminum are a threat to American national security. So they had the two parallel investigations. Initially, the president was tweeting out, we're about to make announcements of these things. This is back in May. We're about to make announcements of these things. I'm potentially going to impose import restrictions. Everybody was on the edge of their seat seeing if this was going to happen or not. Eventually, it sort of got postponed. Why? I don't know. Trade policy is complicated. You started to have the groups that were going to be hurt by this thing start to weigh in, right? The consumers of steel, so the automakers, beer can producers for aluminum products. You had trading partners that were going to be the ones hit by these kinds of import restrictions. So in this case, again, the underlying concern in these types of cases is out there, is the overcapacity problem. Too much steel being produced in the world, too much aluminum being produced in the world. A lot of that is coming out of China because of the investment that they have made over the last 15 or 20 years. But the issue is, because of our friends in the Department of Commerce and the International Trade Commission, we already have massive anti-dumping and countervailing duties on steel and aluminum from China already. So just imposing new import restrictions under this national security law really isn't going to hit them. It's going to actually hit our allies, right? It's going to hit the Europeans, potentially Canada, Mexico, Japan. So back last summer, to kind of slow this thing down, you had the Europeans saying, hey, Trump administration, if you actually do use this law to impose import restrictions on our steel exports into your market, you can expect to face retaliation. So the retaliation they came up with was, what can we think of that would really hurt? Bourbon from Kentucky, right? Mitch McConnell. Or dairy products from Wisconsin, Paul Ryan. How many people are from Wisconsin? Nice. I went to graduate school in Wisconsin, so go Badgers. Politically, you could see what it was they were trying to do. Right? Trying to, at this point in time, there were still thoughts of, well, maybe repeal, replace Obamacare. Still had to worry about tax reform. Maybe this, a lot of legislative priorities that hadn't worked their way through the process yet. President Trump still really needed the cooperation of these legislative leaders. So that's who they were targeting. That slowed down the process. Now the reports have gone to the White House. What's he going to do, right? So that's what we're still waiting on today. All of the recommendations are for pretty restrictive tariffs, quotas, or a combination of both. Under each of the proposals, both for steel and aluminum, nobody gets exempted from these things, right? Even in the ones that are designed to really target the potential source of the problem, the China, the Russia, the countries for which overcapacity might be coming in, or the ones that you might actually be concerned about for national security reasons. Big tariffs on those countries, but everybody else would get hit with a quota that basically says you can't export anything more than what you sent to us last year. That's a quota, right? So if the economy takes off and all of a sudden there's massive demand for steel, nope. Canada, Mexico, everybody, you're stuck exporting what you sent to us last year, right? So we'll see. That's the decisions that need to be made by the president by April in those two cases. So the last case here is the other ongoing one is this China unfair trade case under another unconventional law that we haven't seen used in almost 20 years or so, this Section 301 law. So here the concern is about forced technology transfer, right? So you've got all these Western companies, multinationals that want to do business in China, American companies, European companies, Japanese companies. They want to produce, export, sell stuff into the Chinese market. The tariffs might be too high. So what they have to do instead is they need to locate a plant within China to actually produce. But you can't just set up a wholly owned subsidiary within China. If you want to set up a plant with China, they may make it so that you have to do it as a joint venture. You have to set it up with a local Chinese firm. And that local Chinese firm may not be a private firm. It may be a state-owned enterprise, right, that has connections with the government. And you may be forced to share the crown jewels of technology that makes your, car great or your semiconductor great or whatever your product is really great. And you may be worried about that if you're a company and not want to share it because you might worry that it might get lost or other people might find it and start to use it. So that investigation is still ongoing. We don't know what's going to come out of that. It may involve a WTO dispute, sort of best case scenario. It may involve changing how we do the CFIUS process or how we think about investment having to deal with China. It could involve, worst case scenario, unilateral trade restrictions. Right? This is how this law, or at least the threat of those, was actively used back in the 1980s before this thing called the WTO came around. So there's a lot of these investigations that have started under the Trump administration that are still ongoing, that are quite new, that are things that, to be honest, haven't actually happened in my working lifetime for the most part. These are laws that were actively used when I was in graduate school in the mid-1990s but then sort of went away. I've been waiting my whole life for these things to come back. So it's a very exciting time for me, but for you as well. These are things that people a generation ahead of you have no experience dealing with either. So it's a great time for you. You're just as much an expert on this stuff at this stage as anybody else because nobody else has really worked in this area.
If we read USTR's report on China's WTO compliance or compliance with its WTO obligations, it seems to make the case that China excels at operating in the gray areas of where the WTO does not necessarily apply. So as we are thinking about retaliation against China using Section 301, where would you think the U.S. could also operate in those gray areas without sort of violating our commitments?
I want to answer it a little bit differently and talk a little bit about the gray areas because I think this is an important point that we really haven't fully fleshed out yet, I think, in terms of the public debate on this. So the question is, just to kind of rephrase it, essentially what China is being accused of doing is doing things that may not be, technical violations of WTO rules. They're sort of acting in the gray areas. And the question was, well, how could we retaliate also in the gray areas so that we're not violating the rules? So my approach wouldn't think of it that way. What I would say, first of all, is it is true that the WTO is an incomplete contract, right? When this thing was written down and the GATT before it, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, they could not foresee all of the ways in which policymakers would be so incredibly creative that they would be able to basically restrict trade and just write down red lines for all of this stuff. But what they did do is they wrote down a provision in Article, I think, 23 of the original GATT that's still there that allows countries to file what are called non-violation, nullification, and impairment complaints, which is basically something like, even if you haven't explicitly broken some rule that's exactly there, if you're engaging in policies that are really frustrating the benefits that we would have normally expected to receive out of this deal, we can still use the dispute settlement features of the WTO to deal with that. Now, you haven't seen a ton of these kinds of disputes at the WTO being filed. I'm not expecting this administration to actually go down this path because they have kind of made the opposite case. If you want to pursue that line of thinking, arguably, right, you're asking, in essence, for the WTO to rule on things that really haven't been explicitly written out. But this administration has actually argued the opposite. Their main argument has been frequently that the WTO has ruled in a lot of ways against the United States in ways that haven't been explicitly written down, and that has caused us to essentially lose sovereignty. So they've essentially kind of painted us into a corner because now we can't use that real argument against China. So to answer your question, I honestly don't know. It's not something that I've thought too hard about. I mean, the obvious answers or the more obvious answers would be things on investment where there aren't really great rules. It's hard to see how that would be tremendously effective given how much discretion we already have to prevent Chinese investment from coming into the United States that's already actively deployed. And the fact that, investment in many respects is beneficial, right? If it creates productive activity that would be happening here and creates jobs that would be happening here that are better than the alternatives, it's not clear that those are something that we would want to stop. I'm not optimistic that that's a fruitful way of kind of dealing with this as a longer term problem, and I don't have a good path or set of solutions to get us out of there. So that's one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to this report. Maybe it will contain things that will be new to me. So we'll see. Is anybody here writing the 301 report? Okay, too bad.
One is we have talked a lot about goods, but not about services.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how services fit in the picture, and considering the definition of what is a service and how a service is exchanged is not very clear, and it's going to change. Even if we were to make a definition this year, it'll be different in 3 years. How do services fit in? And then my second question is about the Florida tomato growers and the seasonal anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And do you one of the challenges that they cite is the internal procedures in the U.S. to bring a claim to commerce. Do you think that there is a seasonal anti-dumping and countervailing duty position could be a positive thing, or is this one industry making noise?
Let's start with the second question. Any guesses as to my response, based if you have heard trade talks, my general feelings toward anti-dumping and whether making it even more expansive. Okay, I won't put that pressure on you. I don't think that's a particularly good approach because I think it's another avenue for which it would get misused and abused. I mean, I know that there's political calls for it. I know there's requests to kind of put it into the NAFTA, and these things have been out there for a long time. Seasonality is it's part of life in the product space, and I don't think having special unfair trade laws to kind of deal with it is the right approach to go. The services question, I think, is a fascinating one, and it's really interesting because, we've really heard nothing about services in the last, since April, 2016, essentially, right? It's just been all about not only trade in goods, but not even really advanced manufacturing stuff, right? It's all about these old industries. It's about primaries. It's about steel and aluminum and lumber, and it's not the solar panels a little bit, jets a little bit, but right? I mean, it's a lot of old stuff. And services where there are still huge barriers to trade, and this was kind of the next generation of negotiations in trade deals, right? Trying to liberalize additionally trade and services where the United States, U.S. firms, the U.S. economy is really at the frontier, right? Trying to push other countries to open up this product space, to try to write down international rules where we really don't have any in a lot of different areas here. There's basic stuff on services, but a lot of the new things, digital trade, electronic commerce, none of that stuff was around when we were writing the NAFTA agreement, right? Or the WTO and the Uruguay round. And we're not hearing about any of that at all, right? And so I think that's It's a really, really big concern. The world is going on in a completely now ruleless way. And I don't see that, at least on the United States' side, getting reversed anytime soon. I think that's too bad, because I think other countries around the world have ideas for what they want those rules to be. And then they're not necessarily consistent with what the United States' view of that would necessarily be.
So this is a question about the latest Canadian WTO complaint against the U.S., which was interesting because a lot of the measures of the WTO that Canada has challenged actually pertain to Chinese dumping actions. But the complaint is that U.S. DOC practice is not in compliance with the WTO anti-dumping agreement. So I was just wondering what your view is in terms of why Canada has impugned 100 or more of these measures and basically thrown the kitchen sink at the U.S., and where it's sort of getting at strategically with that complaint.
So this was a dispute that was actually, I think, filed in Geneva at the WTO back in December and didn't become public until late January or so. So Canada has filed a dispute against the way the U.S. does anti-dumping CVD, and to kind of make their case, they said, well, the U.S. has essentially done it wrong in these 100 and something different earlier cases, only a handful of which had anything to do with Canada, right? Most of them were virtually all of them were against all other countries, but there were a lot in there against China, Europe, Japan, Korea, et cetera. And so the question, why was that Canada's strategy? Well, their legal strategy was essentially they needed to make the case it just wasn't a one-off thing that was happening in, say, softwood lumber. They needed to kind of show that there's a pattern of behavior that goes back for a long period of time, to show that this is kind of a systemic thing that the U.S. does wrong. And to make that case, since there hadn't been a lot of earlier anti-dumping CVD against Canada, they had to pick out earlier cases against other countries. So that's one. But the bigger question of why are they doing this, I think can be traced to what their frustration is in the NAFTA negotiations. And the Trump administration really pushing for things like removing enforceable dispute settlement. Not only potentially Chapter 19, so the special provisions handling anti-dumping and CVD stuff, but even potentially getting rid of Chapter 20, right? The basic state-to-state dispute settlement, making a trade agreement no longer enforceable, right? Enforceable in the sense that if I think you've done something wrong and I bring a case against you, you can't stop the case. If I win the case against you and you refuse to stop doing that thing that's wrong, I can be authorized to retaliate against you. And I can be authorized to retaliate to eliminate your exports into my market by the same amount as what you eliminated me selling into your market because of the thing that you did wrong in the first place, to basically even out the deal. The Trump administration is saying that we want to throw out that system of dispute settlement, right? That allows smaller countries that are less powerful, the Canadas, the Mexicos, and these kinds of relationship, to be able to protect their legal rights, right? So smaller, less powerful countries, they tend to like having legalistic systems that are less reliant on power and bullying and that kind of thing. This administration doesn't like those systems and is threatened not only ripping them out of the NAFTA, but changing things at the WTO as well. So my sense on the Canadian side was, it's largely about softwood lumber. It's a $5 billion case at a 20% tariff. It's $1 billion of tax revenue a year that they're worried that they potentially might lose out on. But I think they also recognize that they really run the risk under this administration of facing a lot more of these types of anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases and having the legal provisions stripped out of NAFTA, which then only leaves them with something at the WTO. So I think they felt that that was, filing a WTO dispute was their way to kind of protect themselves and to signal to the Trump administration just the seriousness of where they are in the negotiations.
I have sort of a broader question. When we look not only at the Section 232 investigation and recommendation, but also, the tabling of rules of origin in NAFTA and essentially the elimination of deemed originating in the NAFTA negotiations, do you see this as forming something along the lines of a cohesive national strategy when it comes to manufactured goods, or is this just, side effects of trade being in the public eye so much, or what can we look forward to in the future, looking at all this either as an indicator or just happenstance?
So that's a great question, and one that I kind of struggle with every day. Is so that maybe we'll try to reinterpret it as how I think about it, is trying to figure out what this administration's strategy is. So on the one hand, I will give them credit for recognizing that there are significant challenges out there that have to be dealt with, and the biggest one I think is China. Right? It's the fact, and put aside the military issue, the geopolitics, and the fact non-democracy and that kind of stuff. Not talking about that. Just the fact that they're not a market economy. They operate differently than we do. Poses new fundamental challenges for the trading system, right? The WTO system to deal with that. The question of, are the existing rules sufficient? I gave an earlier argument to say, well, these non-violation complaints haven't really tested the full extent of the rules. I could argue we could push further on that before blowing up the whole system. But you can make a legitimate argument to say that might not work, right? And we actually need to have new rules to address that. So I recognize and am with the administration on dealing with the seriousness of China as an issue. What I don't yet see, though, is a real effective strategy in the steps that or a couple of the steps that you've identified. So, when I looked at the national security reports, the Section 232 reports, I read them as the following. Secretary Ross has said that in order for the U.S. steel and aluminum sectors to be competitive, they need to be operating at 80% capacity. So he's going to mandate government policies that are going to get the U.S. industries to be operating at 80% capacity, right? And he's going to do it through trade policy, either really high tariffs, really restrictive quotas, some combination of the two, to mandate effectively that the steel and aluminum industries operate at 80% capacity. To me, that sounds a lot like we're heading down the path towards not allowing markets to function, right? And heading toward sort of state planning and the model that China and the Soviet Union before it had, right? So that combined with the rules of origin, which are, we are not going to allow firms to make decisions about where they want to source their inputs, but we're going to tell them that they need to buy more from, these particular countries, also pushes in that direction. And so that I see as kind of worrisome. You could argue that is a strategy, but to me, that's a very heavy-handed strategy, and it's moving away from markets. And I think how we can use markets effectively to address the problems that we face.
To sort of continue down that train of thought, so how would you best advise or best think about the way that markets can optimize in a way that the administration isn't or can't with the current laws? I mean, if 232 or 301 or 201s aren't the best way to think about it for them, and they can't muster international support for what they're looking for, or enough international support to leverage against China or other bad actors, what's the best way for markets to deal with that? And can markets react fast enough to sort of not have these detrimental effects on certain populations within the U.S. that might be feeling some of the pressures that led to maybe the Trump administration existing?
First of all, I would say that and I think this was more to your last question about, certain communities, sectors suffering, and maybe that actually having had an impact on the election. So I think that's absolutely true. But I wouldn't necessarily pin all of that on, bad actors or even necessarily, even China, right? And even if you were to pin it on China, you might say to yourself, well, even if China had not come along, the trade still would have meant that there was going to be sectors in the economy and workers in the economy that were making goods that now had to compete with foreign competition, that was a new source of competition for them. They weren't able to adjust effectively. They got left behind, right? So it would have happened, to my mind, even if China hadn't come along and it had been some other constellation of new countries coming onto the scene, or if China had come along and been a completely democratic, market-oriented economy, right? Imagine India could ever, sort of get their act together. It's a democracy, right? It could be a market economy, and it could be very different from how China is, but it's huge is the main point, and it would have a similar size potential impact on the global economy in terms of adjustment. So I think that's an issue that is there, would have had to be dealt with, even if we didn't have these kind of separate issues of concern like China, in the fact that it just, because it's not a market economy, just operates under a fundamentally different set of rules. So the question I would then try to answer is, well, how do you deal with the China concern? The way that this administration is approaching it is through essentially sticks, right? We're going to see what the outcomes of the investigations are, but it looks like so far it's just tariffs, 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 quantitative restrictions, tariffs, right? Some combination of those things. What's the incentive for China to change? And I think that's the real big question. There was a period of time when China was becoming more market-oriented, when it was reforming, when it was privatizing, when it was making its state-owned enterprises become smaller. So I think what's important for us to think about is, how does China not get back to that, but see that in their own interests, right? And there are elements of being more market-oriented that are in China's own interests. You know, these state-owned enterprises that they have, you know, yes, they can smooth employment, and they have buffers, but they're incredibly inefficient, and they're a drag on the overall economy in terms of the resources that they employ relative to how productive they are. So it's in China's own interest to reform some of these things. So the question is, well, how do you kind of allow that to flourish and nourish? And I would say that you need to have not just the sticks, but you need to have some carrots out there as well, right? So you need to have negotiations that are going to make it, they're going to incentivize China to want to be able to do that kind of thing. And there, I don't think that necessarily the United States unilaterally can create the incentives and the carrots. You know, we're a great country, but we're only 300 million people. You know, outside of China, there's another 5.5 billion out there. So why not have us get together with the Europeans and other countries around the world that all really, to me, would seem to have a common interest in this, and try to create positive incentives for China to go down a path that we'd be more comfortable with. I think that's the big issue that has to be talked about, and how do we use markets to do that? Maybe we're just going to get to the stage where it's not 100% feasible for us to have market economies and non-market economies, you know, interacting seamlessly in a rules-based system. I'm not fully convinced of that yet. That case would need to be made to me, but I think we need to think through that a little bit more clearly and carefully than we have previously. So anyway, that's not a very good answer. You asked not only 4 questions, but 4 really big questions. These are the exactly right questions that I think we need to be struggling with, though, in terms of public policy. And we're not there yet, in terms, at least the public side of things.
I have a broad question concerning TPP. President Trump in Davos told in an interview that his administration might consider joining the partnership again. I'm really wondering what changes and improvement could make the administration to join the negotiations again.
Yeah, I don't know. He says so much that I don't know. No, I wouldn't be optimistic. And the main reason why I wouldn't be optimistic is, you know, when the one consistent thing that this administration, the president and his chief trade people have consistently gone back to is their continual reliance on trade deficits as their metric of success. And, you know, we're seeing that in the NAFTA negotiations. Somehow they want to rewrite this deal to guarantee balanced trade. The only way that you can guarantee balanced trade is by saying we're not going to rely on markets anymore. Anytime my country or your country exports more than we import, we're going to have the government step in and buy or sell the difference, right? That's the only way that you can guarantee balanced trade. But then you're saying we're giving up on markets. But this is the one thing they've never backed off of. This is his President Trump's, this is how he defines success when it comes to trade. And so that's why I'm not optimistic, because nobody else in the world, no other country, well, that's out there rationally negotiating trade deals is thinking about these things that way. And they're not going to be willing to sign some kind of agreement that demands that you have balanced trade at the end of the day. And I think that's what we're running into right now with Canada and Mexico. So I'm not optimistic on TPP unless he were to somehow come around on this idea that balanced trade is what was going to determine success in a bilateral trading relationship. But the advisors that he has around him seem to think this as well, and that message just doesn't seem to be getting through. So I don't have good news on that, unfortunately. Sorry.
So my question's back to Section 232. Are there actions that the industry, the steel and aluminum users, could take to perhaps mitigate the harm that these could cause? Or could Congress get involved in some way? Do you see this playing out in the next couple of months before the April deadline?
No, it's all bad. Let me elaborate a little bit. So even when we did this back in 2001-2 under the safeguard law, which is a very different procedure, required a lot. It was much more transparent. The other big problems you have with these investigations, it wasn't until the reports were released that I actually knew what they meant by the steel industry or the aluminum industry, right? They never defined it anywhere. And so if you're a consumer, you don't know, does the product that I consume, is that on the list of what they're talking about potentially imposing 54% tariffs on? Do I need to be worried about this, right? None of that information was public until 9 months in, and they finally released the report. Back in 2002, when you're doing this under anti-dumping, countervailing duties, none of that happens, right? All the product scope is defined from the very beginning, so you know if you're implicated in this thing or not, and you know if you have to worry about it. But even back then, when they ended up imposing 30% tariffs, there was a process that they then set up sort of on the fly to deal with exclusions. That if you were a consumer of a product and there was really nobody domestically that made that product and you needed to buy some really, specially refined steel from Japan or Germany, you could submit a petition. There was a process by which they would evaluate, whether there was a public process by which others could come in and counter argue against it. But that process was set up under the kind of standard conventional trade laws after they'd gone through a full investigation where there was a lot more detailed information that had been collected. And even in that, I think, was arguably a disaster. It was just a bureaucratic nightmare for them to have to address. They're potentially going to be faced with something similar now, but it's going to take a long time to get set up. This agency in commerce, as I understand it, is relatively small. The exclusion process that was done back in 2002 was done out of the USTR office, which is much more robust in terms of its staffing, even though this isn't technically its job either. So I am not optimistic that this is going to turn out well. I think there's a separate issue of can they lobby and try to make the public case against doing this and try to convince the president not to do it. But ultimately, if it gets imposed, are there going to be ways that you can get around it through exclusions or something? There, I'm concerned and not optimistic.
So I actually work at the Department of Commerce. So I was listening to the last question, sort of building off of that, where there is very real harm from these imports, especially in steel, and a lot of attention is on Chinese steel. The current system of AD/CVD laws, there's a huge expansion, a huge uptick in the number of cases that the U.S. is litigating and working on. But have you, or do you have any thoughts on also the recent uptick in self-initiation of these cases? Right now we have this whole petition process that you just discussed, but self-initiation is a very different beast.
Yeah. So you're going to be very busy. To be honest, also, it's a good time to be all of you, just because there's going to be a lot of this stuff happening over the next couple of years, and so there's going to be lots of jobs out there in government and the private sector to deal with all of this stuff. So the self-initiation problem is governments lack information about who is hurt by these things. Government statistics just aren't detailed enough. And I know this firsthand, having been in government and wondering, what's going on out there in the world. You somehow, if you're not in government, you think that government is the magic overseer and has access to everything and knows everything. And to be honest, the government knows nothing, unfortunately, right? It's just, it has no funding. It, frequently doesn't have the legal authority to compel you to turn over the information that you actually need to know. So if somebody's injured or not, and is it really because of that reason, or are they making it up and it's for really some other decision that they made that was their fault, that was a really bad choice, but they want to blame it on imports or China or something like that, right? And the difficulty is with self-initiations, you sort of have the government guessing. And I think that's where a big concern can come in. We can have cases that come forward where the government is thinking that there's something there, and they bring a case forward, they end up litigating it, but they're wrong. And they don't do, as kind of a comprehensive a job as even if it had been filed by, petitioners. I guess the other big concern, though, is with the, as much as on the outside as we have historically, as economists, disliked the anti-dumping CVD and even the 201 process, it's much better and transparent and thorough in terms of the information that it collected than what we just saw with the Section 232s, which just collected and processed and examined much, much less information, just because it doesn't have the legal authority to kind of compel companies to go out and turn over information in the same way as it happens under laws, under these other laws. So that, and then the other thing, I guess, on self-initiations is it looks like it all of a sudden becomes much more political too. And so the trading partners that we've spent decades trying to convince, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, these are just, technocratic things. If you satisfy these definitions, you price below, costs, or you price here below your price at home. It's just a technical definition of dumping. Don't worry, we're not mad at you. Like, don't take it personally. We're going to impose, 150% tariffs on you, but it's technocratic, right? Now all of a sudden you introduce self-initiation and it seems to become very political. Now all of a sudden those 150% tariffs aren't a technocratic thing anymore. It's something that some politician decided we're going to initiate here and not there, right? And now you have to worry about trading partners taking it personally in the sense that they're going to retaliate and in other ways as well. So we saw China, right? They self-initiated this sorghum case right after the solar panels and washing machine decisions last month. So we can self-initiate cases. Guess, everybody else can do the same thing as well. And that's not a good sign.
In terms of other countries and their reactions to these different types of methods of, trade barriers, how do you see their reaction kind of evolving over time? And what can they do other than retaliating through the WTO process? What can they do to hit back?
Yeah. So I think that's exactly the right. So we have spent the last 70 plus years building this system and trying to model our own behavior under this system, not always effectively, because we have our own domestic political pressures as well, to try to convince the world to act in a more rules-based system, right? In a rules-based way, according to markets. What's been happening over the last year, if we go down this path, that basically strips all of that away. And all the other countries can say, you know what, national security? China, right? We import $12 billion, $14 billion a year of soybeans from the United States. It makes us kind of reliant on you as a food source. That's a threat to our national security, so maybe we should stop doing that, right? There's nowhere now to draw the line once you use this kind of thing as an excuse. And so I think we can just expect to see other countries beginning to emulate our behavior. And I think we did see this back in, 2009. When with the Recovery Act, there was initially big calls for Buy American provisions in the stimulus package that was put together in early 2009. I don't think as many of them as were initially proposed got put into the deal, but that basically gave carte blanche to all other countries around the world to say, oh, they're putting Buy America stuff in their stimulus package, like we're just going to put Buy India into ours, Buy China into ours, right? So it's by opening up these doors of no longer following the rules and blatantly throwing the rules out the window that I think is ultimately going to give all other countries the opportunity to do the same thing. And we have to remember, right, that 95% of the world's consumers are outside of the United States. Many American companies and workers get their livelihoods from selling their goods and services outside of the United States. And those are the ones that are going to be caught up in these kinds of actions and behavior, and they're going to be hurt. So it's not good, but it'll keep us busy. So anyway, thank you. I appreciate it.